And so we'll start off with Alicante. Be brave. Yes, why not?
Hello. Right. Let us first of all agree that the English have a strange and unsettled and slightly peculiarly ambivalent relationship and attitude about their own country, and more peculiarly specifically about their own countryside. On the one hand, you have this notion of the English pastoral, Arcadia, Albion, the golden country, as Winston Smith dreamily refers to it in Orwell's 1984. You have lyricists like Paul Weller singing in Tales from the Riverbank about tales from the pastoral fields and both life and death carried in the stream, very romantic views. This is the country of Vaughan Williams and William Morris, of Wordsworth and Blake, of textile weaving and John Barleycorn, Green Man, of Beatrix Potter and Worship Down and Richard Adams, blah, blah, blah. However, and here's the crux, however, to the English, the idea of home is also extremely important. You think of Bilbo Baggins' reluctance to leave the Shire in The Hobbit. I mean, back then, Tolkien was making a comment in a satire on Middle England and Little England, and the petty bourgeois who were coming up in the 30s and their reluctance to leave their cloistered, sheltered lives. But this is very common. This is very common in the English psyche, the idea of home, whether it's geographical or psychological, because home can also be psychological. Mike Leigh, who's Mancunian and Jewish, his actual spiritual home, frankly, is North London to all intents and purposes. In the film Get Carter, Michael Caine's character Jack comes from Newcastle, but he's been living in London as a gangster for so long that when he goes back to investigate his brother's murder in Newcastle, he finds it a very strange and unsettling, perplexing place. In the Shane Meadows film Dead Man Shoots, for instance, Paddy Considine, who plays a soldier, who's been away for a while. When he comes back, and I mention those two films together, Get Carter and Dead Man Shoots, because thematically they're very similar. When he comes back to investigate his brother's murder, again he finds it a very strange, perplexing and unsettling place, filled with sort of people the Americans would call poor white trash in Derbyshire, the sort of things that we used to call perhaps chavs. So the point is the English don't travel particularly well. When they're abroad, they're probably more English than English. Their Englishness is accentuated to hilarious kind of degrees, but in their own country, they don't know what the hell they're doing. You could travel 25 miles and any compass direction for an English person to feel unsettled and peculiar. The fact is this country is very small. We don't really have a tradition of road movies in this country. There are a few notable exceptions to that. There's the films of Patrick Keeler, London and Robinson in Space. Even despite that, in Robinson in Space, the narrator, or not narrator, but Robinson, the character, goes completely nuts when out of his comfort zone. There's Chris Petit's Radio On in the 80s, which is more like a sort of inner journey. It's a kind of inner existential journey more than a geographical journey. So we don't really have road movies. We don't really have the tradition of the American hobo drifting around. We're too small. England has become more homogenised. It's true. Up and down the nation, there's Cafe Nero and Starbucks, but this isn't really reflected yet in cinema. We're still very uneasy to go outside our front doors. Now, English cinema has a great and long history over many genres that detail this sort of unease, particularly the horror genre. We have Witchfinder General, for instance, which is in East Anglia. We think that the countryside of Witchfinder General is a strange and dark and pagan place. And in Blood and Satan's Claw, set in Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire, again, strange pagan stuff is afoot. That film, which is set in the 17th century, is about demonic possession taking over a small cloistered community. And it's virtually anthropology, that film. It's a very close and detailed look at a pre-industrialised community. The countryside for the English and the English directors is still seen as a strange and slightly scary place. Ben Wheatley, a relatively new director, his cinematic aesthetic, that some of you may have seen Sightseers, is talking about a very strange, witchy aesthetic. Harking back to the kind of folk cinema, if you like, things like With Ed and I, The Wicker Man, and the aforementioned Blood and Satan's Claw. Now, Sightseers is about a pair of serial killers, or one serial killer, one nascent and latent serial killer, who go off on a strange homicidal rampage around the country. But the point is, the further into the country they go, the more in-country they go, the more murderous and strange and violent they become. become, the more stone circles and monoliths they pass, the more wilder they become, as if they're plugged into some sort of weird blood-soaked ley line that's transmitting images from this blood-soaked, primitive pagan Britain. So straddling horror and comedy. It's also this unease with the English countryside. There's also a hallmark of comedy as well, obviously. It's extreme as horror. Reflection of things like League of Gentlemen, in which the countryside is just full of inbred nutcases. There's another series called How Do You Want Me, in which Dylan Moran goes to the country with his new bride, Charlotte Coleman, and just finds them full of violent local yokels. There's a trip, of course, with Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon, in which Steve Coogan has a terrible time in the country, and Rob Brydon has a lovely time in the country, and the tension is between those two characters and their reaction to the country. And we have, of course, Keith Pratt and Kaz Marie and Mike Lee's Nuts and Mace, which is sightseers very much resembles, although the director swears to God that he only saw Nuts and May about 2 weeks before they started shooting. But the Mac Daddy, I suppose, of being terribly uneasy in the country is, of course, Widdowne and I. And Widdowne and I, obviously everything goes wrong. They literally went on holiday by mistake. There can be any more kind of English expression of the fear of the country than that. Here bulls go crazy, the rain is constant, the dark is blinding, the locals are very unfriendly, there's a murderous poacher on the loose. It's terrible. We're going to see a small trade from that.
There we go.
Are you the farmer? Shut up, argue with this. We've gone on holiday by mistake. We're in this cottage here. Are you the farmer? Stop saying that, Whitnall. Of course he's a fucking farmer. We're friends of Montague Whitnall. We desperately need fuel and water. Montague Whitnall. You must know him. Fat man owns the cottage.
Said a fat man. Long time. Queer song. Think his name's French or something.
French.
Aye, up in Dartouch. They ain't been in for a couple of years. Last time I saw him, he was with his son.
Yeah, that's it. Listen, we're going to find you. We're not from London. Could we have fuel and water?
I can bring you some water later. But I've got the cow and want to pay first.
Where? Shut up! Nothing, thank you. What about food? Do you think you can sell us some?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
There's one version of Englishness there. We said the Englishman abroad in England, weren't we, before?
But my question is, it's interesting that quite a lot of the meanings that people have about nations are all coming from a left-wing perspective, but there's not many right-wing points of view when talking about the history or the meanings of things necessarily. But maybe because that's the establishment, and filmmaking is, we like to think, anti-establishment. So I don't know if you talk about the right-wing definition of Englishness and how it can be shown in movies.
Well, perhaps you might like to check out the heritage films of the 80s, which were made at a time when Thatcher was dismantling a lot of the manufacturing base.
Yeah.
And instead what we had was the idea of England almost as a kind of tourist park, either at home or abroad. So you've got like something like, sort of Morris or another country, or a room with a view here. And abroad you have the sort of Raj experience with Passes to India and on TV, Jewel and the Crown. These are all different ideas of England as a commodity. It's the commodification of the nation, if you like. So I guess
I guess they were less didactic and more subtextual when doing that, whereas it seems to me that the left-wing position is much more kind of above the line and much more on the nose.
Broadly speaking, the left-wing position is more social realist than all things. I'd just like to add for that of the foreign directors who do come to England and do shoot films about Britain, they seem to have a naturally keen eye for the culture and for the national stereotypes or characteristics, if you like. Antonio, with Blow Up, saw something quite empty and shallow about the 1960s, which I think, in hindsight, I think he had a point. That's beyond the fact that he does make films, or did make films, about shallow and empty and unspiritual lives anyway. The thing I just
I was intrigued by your description of film showing the countryside as a sort of dystopia.
This is just my thesis. I'm sure there are others that show it's a wonderful golden place.
It's very interesting. I've seen that idea in literature and in a film like The Wicker Man, but in both cases it tends to be places like the Welsh borders or off the Scottish mainland rather than England itself. As a foreigner, I have always felt slightly uneasy in the countryside about quite understanding why.
As a Londoner, I do too.
Yes, so anything outside the M25, I start getting jittery. But I assume that English people would feel at home in the countryside, and I think it's because of all that English Heritage National Trust programs, popular culture program that escapes the country.
I think there's definitely an ambivalence there. I think on the one hand, perhaps in more sort of literary tradition, we revere the sort of the sort of pastoral or idyll of the countryside. Anything going back to the Arthurian myths, even though they're actually Welsh and French, or sort of John Barleycorn, and all that sort of idea of the romantic Blakean sort of vision of the countryside. But I think in practice, there's more uneasy, particularly for those who come from metropolis and cities. I think this may be a consequence, deep down in the kind of genetic memory, perhaps, of being corralled from the country into cities during the Industrial Revolution, perhaps. At one stage, I think we were the most industrialised nation in the world at one stage, and I think more people were living, or let's say, sort of hijacked and corralled into cities than at any time before. I think perhaps maybe this accounts perhaps for some sort of sense of that displacement, perhaps that, as I said, some genetic memory of a slight kind of frisson when it comes to that. Or it may be just because there are fewer streetlights and it's really fucking scary.